I'm going to start actually right where Daniel kind of left off with this notion of it's a personal decision what you kind of decide you study, what's interesting to you, and where you draw the lines around what where you can go and what you want to do. And for me, so my most recent project is this book project about a crime laboratory. And I had I had a line that I drew early on because I realized during a crime scene investigation class that I was auditing that there was no way I was going to a crime scene. I got actually physically ill just looking at the images of the crime scene. And I thought, this is not something that I can undertake. And of course, it turned out that criminalists, the analysts in the crime lab, they don't go to the crime scene, actually. So it didn't turn out to be a large part of the study anyway, but I realized that was going to be problematic for me. But the other thing is that, like, I have kind of a rule about how I take on new projects. And that rule for me is that I have to find the work itself very interesting, or I don't pay enough attention to what's going on. If you're going to be there for a year or more, like, you really have to find it interesting. And so for me, that's kind of how I choose my projects. And one of the nice things about doing that is, and studying organizations like crime labs, is that other people typically find these settings interesting as well. And that's the kind of seductive part of doing these studies of unusual or extreme contexts. What it also means is that your talks are rarely boring, because lots of people are interested in finding out about the dynamics of these kinds of settings. On the sort of downside, what I sometimes find is that people get sometimes so interested in the context that they kind of forget to engage with the theoretical ideas, which is kind of the whole point of doing this, right? That's what our job is. So what I thought I would talk about a little bit in the next 15 minutes is how you take this awesome, interesting data and use it to develop theoretical ideas that people will pay attention to. And so I want to just, the way I'm going to do it is just to offer a few examples from this project. And in the book, basically what I do is I describe what forensic scientists actually do. And I just thought I'd give you a little bit of background on that, right? So forensic scientists are applied scientists, right? And they have bachelor's and master's degrees in biology and chemistry, and they work in a lab analyzing evidence. There's a lot of different kinds of evidence they look at. They also testify in court as expert witnesses. So they work in the lab and they interact with investigators and judges and juries and lawyers, right? So the questions I'm looking at are, what does it look like to be a forensic scientist? That's kind of the descriptive part. And then more interesting theoretically is, how is it that this applied science work is influenced by the fact that it's basically science done in the service of justice? And I really am very interested in my research in how the social structures of organizations influence people's work. And so that's kind of what I focus on. And then I also look at the implications of this for expert work. And these latter two questions, I think, are where the theory is in the project. And the big point here is that crime labs basically are expert work that's done at the intersection of science and law. So criminalists do bench work. They work hard to ensure that they do good science from the perspective of their larger community of forensic scientists. And they, at the same time, are providing facts to the criminal justice community. So they're interacting with this whole community, and that really influences how their work gets done. And then a key fact about this is that in the US, at least, the organizational structure of crime labs is embedded within the criminal justice community. So they're this kind of patchwork of agencies that control the work of science of crime labs. They report to the FBI, the Department of Justice, the police department, a sheriff's office, a DA's office, and these agencies actually control the budgets of crime laboratories. So that's just the background of kind of what I'm going to give you. What I want to do is talk about three aspects of fieldwork and analysis that are important, I think, for generating theoretical ideas from the data. So first, unusual moments. So these are not hard to recognize in the field, but then you have to think about what are you going to do with them? And then repeated behaviors. I think also it isn't hard to recognize repeated behaviors, but I think that Daniel's point here is really valid, that you can really become inured to like kind of what's going on, and you have to figure out where the boundaries are, what's important about these specific behaviors, how they relate to one another. They can be kind of difficult to unpack. And then the last point I want to make is kind of the knotty problem of analytic generalizability, right? So how do you take what you see in your context and make it relevant elsewhere? And what I'm going to say about that is basically comparison is the key, right? So first, in terms of unusual moments, in this project, right when I started my field work, there was this big blow up in the world of forensic science. The National Academy of Sciences in the US released this report, a National Academy of Science report, that said that the scientific basis of forensics needs reinforcing. There's a lack of training and a lack of standardized procedures. The whole system lacks resources, and they thought we should create a new federal agency. What you can see from these quotes I have up is that the report basically suggested that DNA profiling is the only forensic science that's thoroughly grounded in science, and the rest of the field is kind of crap, right? It doesn't have the scientific rigor. This is, this report actually came out the week I started my field work. So it was like my big dramatic introduction to the lab, which is totally an ethnographer's dream. You're like, oh my gosh, this big thing is happening. It's dramatic, it seems important, and I'm sitting here. I have a front row seat for this. However, as this kind of evolved, what you start to realize about these unusual moments is that they aren't sometimes all that unusual, that they herald, that they kind of can be larger than life, but they can also be reflective of pretty important dynamics that are going on and sort of underlying. Forensic science, for instance, is always under a lot of scrutiny. I mean, I think science in general now is under a lot more scrutiny than it used to be. It doesn't have the same authority, right? And we can totally see that in the current crisis, but even before. And so forensic science, in some ways, even more so, because it's embedded in a publicly funded criminal justice system that we care about a lot. So forensic science is often in the news. So what this particular unusual moment sort of represented was a lot of different things, but also it was in one way representative of the kind of public scrutiny that forensic science gets. Your work can show up on the nightly news if you're a forensic scientist. It's in the newspaper. This is an important dynamic. So when you have these unusual moments, you want to, I think, mark them as something unusual, but at the same time, think about what is representative about the dynamic that's going on around these unusual moments. How does it affect the people? In the case of the crime lab I was studying, this response went on over many, many months as the implications of the report kind of worked their way out into, it was in the press in the beginning, but it became like a big issue in the court system for a lot of different crime labs. And also inside the lab I was studying, these things kind of work their way out in a lot of different ways, right? So I ended up kind of following along what were the consequences of this report. It just kept popping up throughout my entire time in the field. So 18 months of, people bringing it up. And actually, this is a little bit related to one of the points Daniel made earlier about formal interviews, right? So these are the kinds of things that I might hold on to. And like, if I don't find out enough at the beginning of my project, these are things like I make a list of, if I'm going to do interviews, what are they going to be about, right? And so in this project at the end, there were things that I didn't see enough of that I wanted to learn more about. And those were kind of marked for the interviews. which were much less formal than a normal formal interview would be, because I, as you were saying, like I knew everybody, right? And so I would ask, I talked to so-and-so about the NAS report. How do you think that affected what you guys do in your unit or whatever, right? And have them tell me a story about that. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point I wanted to make is, like, you've got these unusual moments, but what about the flip side, right? Repeated behaviors. And repeated behaviors, I think, are really important to pay attention to. When people start talking about something, a lot of the same thing, or they're doing the same things over and over, it's, even if you're not studying routines, it's incumbent on you to kind of figure out why this repeated behavior. My dissertation, one of my dissertation advisors was Bob Sutton, and he always said, like, pay attention to what people complain about, because you'll see in organizations, people are complaining about the same things. Those things are kind of important to probe into, even though it seems just like, kind of, could just be a routine of complaining. Like John Weeks has this great book on British banks. If you haven't read it, you should. It's awesome, about like the complaint culture there. But anyway, so what is the repeated behavior that I noticed in crime labs? In crime labs, tons of anxious, worrying, complaining about testifying, right? So they're constantly talking to one another about nervous talk, like about going to court, and I don't want to have to testify, or I've been subpoenaed, I really am nervous. You can see these quotes when people talk about it, what they say. I'm terrified. I lost 10 pounds last time I had to go to court, right? And there was so much talk about this in the hallways that I had this moment, like my second week in the field, where I was like, okay, I'm going to be going to court a lot. I better like get prepared for that and figure out, like, do I need to dress up more? Like, what's going on? They kept suits in their cubicles in case they got called to go to court. Okay. So I handed out my card to like everybody I met and said, like, if you're going to court, let me know. It turned out they almost never go to court. Right? They complain all the time about going to court. They are very stressed out about going to court, but they don't actually, in 2% of the cases, criminalists end up getting called to the stand, right? So they almost never go. And so that dynamic was really interesting and really important, right? It's not a repeated behavior to go to court, but it was to complain about it. So I really, wanted to figure out why and what was going on around this. And as I looked at what they did in the lab, what I realized was they spend a ton of time preparing to go to court, despite the fact that they don't go, right? It's not just that they're talking about it in the hallways, but they do like mock trials in the lab. They all go to training to figure out how to go to court. And ultimately I did that too, because I wasn't getting to go to court because nobody was going. So I'm like, I better go to the training at least to see what's going on. They end up attending with one another. If you go to court, often if a criminalist goes to court, a few people from the lab will go along. They'll watch the testimony. They write a little write-up about it. They talk about it with one another on the walk back, right? So I really knew it was important to dig into, like, okay, this is a repeated complaint that we've been having here. They're talking about it all the time. What is going on with it? What are the organizational aspects of it? And ultimately thinking about how it's such a high stakes moment for them, even though it's very rare. It led me to really think about, what does it mean to be a criminalist in the courtroom, right? They're sort of marginal members of the community of criminal justice because they spend all their time in the lab. They're not sworn like the police. They're not really a part of the district attorney's office or any of the legal kind of elements of it. And like I said, these are these two worlds that they're a part of. They really are afraid that the science that they're presenting is going to be attacked. They're afraid they're going to get personally attacked because the law is very adversarial in the US, right? And that's what's going on, which is very different from the science model of we're all building on each other's work to come to a conclusion, right? So this adversarialness really is anxiety provoking for them. And it really started a whole lot of different forms of analysis for me to kind of, I kind of keyed in on that, complaining about court as a trigger for all of these other aspects of the analysis that were important to do. Okay, so like finally, I think something has caught your eye in the field, whether it's an unusual something or it's a repetitive something, and you start to kind of dig into what it means. And so then what? And I think really, I know most of you probably know this if you do qualitative work, but it's worth kind of repeating that the most important aspect of developing theory from any kind of context, extreme, unusual, regular, boring, I don't know, is the notion of constant comparison, right? So how is it that you turn these observations of interesting stuff into, something theoretical that you can write for a journal? And so this image actually is, these are cocaine crystals as seen under a microscope. And this is stuff that the narcotics analysts in the lab that I studied would be looking at all the time. I watched them do a ton of identifications of controlled substances. And so at one point, like I was saying earlier, this fallout from the National Academy of Sciences report really started to affect lots of different units in the lab. And I was still paying attention to like, what, how did people talk about this report? What was going on? What were they doing? And in firearms, they were complaining that they didn't want, so again, DNA was like this gold standard that everybody was being held up to. And in firearms, they were talking about like, we don't want to be compared to DNA. Why does everybody think that we could be like DNA? Our work's completely different from DNA. It's much more holistic. It's not about, they would actually say what we do is very subjective, right? So they were really, very actively fighting against being compared to DNA. In toxicology, they were totally loving it. Like they do tons and tons of really, in some ways, rote testing of urine and blood samples on a GCMS instrument. So like their reports were already very detailed. They had been making more changes to how they were writing their reports before this NAS thing came out. So they already knew, they were interested in expressing more about measurement error. And that was one of the big complaints in the report, that these other sciences don't do that. So they were like totally on board with this and like totally on top of it, doing all this stuff. Now, narcotics was kind of in the middle, and the criminalists in there were worried about whether it was going to change the rules of how they did their analysis. So they did this crystal testing, that's what this image is, and they did like many crystal tests every single day most of what they identified, I couldn't get a picture of it, but most of what they identified was actually methamphetamine in the lab I studied, not cocaine, but this is what I found, so this is what we're going with. But they were doing this multiple times a day, quick, easy microcrystal testing. But the association, the Narcotics Association, basically argued that this isn't as definitive as an instrumented test, right? So they were very worried that they were going to be forced to put everything on an instrument instead of looking at this more under a microscope, the crystal testing, which they felt was more, honestly, more crafty and more to their, let them be more autonomous about what they do. And so I saw all these kind of different responses across these different units over time. And I really wanted to kind of figure out like what was driving these different responses. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And this is where the comparison comes in. And I'm going to show you, and hopefully this works, I don't know, some crazy tables. So I spent a lot of time thinking about it and realized, okay, I got to do some tables. None of these show up in the paper. I know you can't read them. There's too much stuff on there, right? But like, basically just to give you a sense of, I did across these 4 units, what are the different ways that they, like, what does the work look like across these units? What are their techniques looking like? How do they care? Do they care about replicability? Do they care about reviewing? How do they do reviewing of one another? What's the technique all about, right? Like, can you measure error? Can you instrument it? How are these different sciences different? What are the, in the press, what's the impression of these groups, right? So I'm doing a lot of that. I looked at what are the different values of these different scientific units? How did those things differ across them? What kind of judgments were they making? You know, this subjective objective dimension, I kind of try to unpack that across the different units, thinking about like what when they expressed their values, what were those about? How were it was clear that narcotics had different values, the criminalists doing it than the toxicologists, who didn't care that they were doing instrumented, slightly more boring work, but the narcotics analysts were all like, I would never be a toxicologist, blah, 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 right? So what does that mean, kind of unpacking those differences? And then ultimately what I came up with, again, I'm sorry you can't read these, but I also wanted to think about, well, what's going on in the environment, like, of their work, right? So what's important here, and how, and I came up with this notion of what is the pathway or the institutional pathways. I ended this final blue table is the one that's actually in the paper. I have this paper in ASQ that came out last year. This is in the paper because I really started thinking about these institutional pathways. Like in some cases, they got a lot of pressure from the press, but they weren't getting any pressure from the courts, right? And so for firearms, they were like, we don't have to change our behavior. We're still getting admitted into our testimonies are being admitted, our reports are admitted, like we're, you know, and we can't be like DNA, right? So they had strong resistance. The pathway for the toxicologists came through the courts. And there was a lot of pressure. There were defense attorneys who were, you know, basically coming into court and saying, you need to do it. These people aren't doing error measurement. And they're like, okay, we're going to do it, right? Because we're going to get challenged in court if we don't do it. So unpacking kind of this pathway was really important. And ultimately, right, what am I doing here? Like, no other setting, even scientific settings, are going to have these identical kind of empirical dimensions to it, right? The, you know, institutional pathway is not going to appear in these other settings the same way that it appears in forensic science. But the theoretical idea about the way that evaluation might travel through these institutional pathways, and the notion that members of different occupational groups are going to respond differently on the basis both of those pathways and of their techniques and values. That notion came from this analysis, right, of looking at all the different ways and comparing them across these different groups. And I think those ideas can be applied in a lot of other domains, right? And so ultimately, like what I'm trying to get across is this notion of taking ideas from these unusual places and making them, you know, analytically generalizable requires, first of all, real close attention while you're in the field or doing your interviews or whatever, both to attending to the, you know, really unusual things that happen and what do those mean, attending to repeated behaviors and what do those mean, and then unpacking that through constant comparison. So you need to ask questions of the data that are really going to allow us to think about what is this extreme context an example of, and how does what we learn in these contexts help us to understand organizations more generally.